far to the north of Tokyo, beyond the shattered dome of Mount Bandai, beyond the scattered islands of Matsushima in Miyagi Prefecture, the rough-hewn bays of Iwate, and the axe-handle-shaped Shimokita Peninsula in Aomori, and across the freezing straits of Tsugaru, there lies the island of Hokkaido. Fringed with high mountains and blessed with wide-open plains perfect for pasture, with fast-flowing rivers, vast wetlands, dark forests, and deep winter snows, the island, the world's 21st largest, marks the most northerly extent of modern Japan. Its distinctive shape looking for all the world like the horned head of some dragon or seahorse floating atop the long body of Japan's largest island, Honshu. Along with that island, as well as the two more southern and somewhat smaller islands of Kyushu and Shikoku, Hokkaido serves as one of the four main islands of Japan. These four islands create the famous shape of the country, perhaps one of the most easily identifiable geographical silhouettes of any state in the world. And yet Hokkaido, now considered so indisputably, integrally Japanese, has only truly been part of the Japanese mainland for the past 150 years. Before that, before the Japanese colonization of Hokkaido, the mysterious island was a frontier beyond the frontier, a faraway and indistinct place peopled by those known in Japan by many names: Ezo, Ainu, Emishi, all of which meant some variation on a similar theme: barbarian. Indeed, the name Hokkaido itself is a modern creation, first applied to the island as it was incorporated into Japan in the Meiji era. For far longer, it was known by the same name as the so-called barbarians who occupied it. Ezo, a word made up of two kanji with the interesting meaning of shrimp and barbarian. Ezo, as the land was for so long known, has been inhabited for at least the past 20,000 years. Yet the people we think of as the modern Japanese, an ethnicity now usually known as the Yamato people, and who in past times referred to themselves as Wajin, only first arrived to the island 800 years ago, and even then only in small numbers, their population limited to the southern tip of Oshima Peninsula, nearest to their native Honshu. The rest of the vast interior of Ezo remained a foreign land. So, who was it who lived on Ezo so long before the arrival of the modern Japanese? Hey there everyone, and welcome to Unseen Japan, the Japan you don't learn about in anime. We focus on long-form, in-depth content about Japanese people, history, and culture, with the goal of helping educate people about the real Japan. Our work is largely based on original Japanese sources, which we do both to minimize distortion, as well as to bring you, our audience, the views and concerns of Japanese people in their own words. We also work to fight misconceptions and prejudices about Japan that exist in the English-speaking world. I'm Noah Oskow, and I'll be your host for this episode. I'm also the author of the original article this video is based on. Japan's historical encounters with indigenous and foreign peoples to its north has been a major subject of my study and authorship for the past year, so if you'd like to go further into the subjects covered here, Japanese dealings with Russia, the settlement of Sakhalin, conflict with the native Ainu, Nivich, and Oroks, or the short-lived samurai republic of Ezo, feel free to click the links below. And if our mission and content interests you, go ahead and hit subscribe. Otherwise, back to the history of the colonization of Hokkaido. Those who lived in the most distant past of the island are, in many ways, lost to our modern knowledge. How they arrived and what became of them remains a hotly contested mystery. Some were the Jomon people, a Neolithic tribal hunter-gatherer society who lived in scattered settlements throughout the islands of modern Japan for a period of over 15,000 years. While the largest concentration of the Jomon lived in the central and northern areas of Honshu, some from among their tribes migrated slowly northward, eventually settling in far Hokkaido around 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. This long Jomon period continued until around 300 BCE in Honshu, where the arrival of another people called the Yayoi, perhaps from the Korean peninsula, and the introduction of rice agriculture eventually saw them and their way of life disappearing into the mists of time. The people who emerged from the Yayoi and Jomon cultures became the Yamato, the modern Japanese ethnic group. In Eizo, however, far beyond the reaches of the incipient Yamato culture, the Jomon lifestyle continued for some hundreds of years more. Meanwhile, another group of people arrived in Eizo from the north, crossing the frozen sea of Okhotsk from the large island we now call Sakhalin. These Okhotsk people arrived around 600 CE, fishing the northern shores of Eizo and hunting sea mammals. The Jomon people had meanwhile morphed into a culture now called the Satsumon, and they and the Okhotsk people lived side by side on the island, the Satsumon hunting the deep interiors of the island while the Okhotsk plied the cold seas. During the 12th century, the Yamato further south in the imperial Heian court in modern Kyoto were seeing the end of an age of high art and poetry. The age of the samurai was just beginning, and the far reaches of northern Honshu were, at least momentarily, still inhabited by another seemingly non-Yamato people, known as the Emishi. But the Okhotsk people in Eizo seem to have disappeared. Whether they were absorbed into the Satsumon culture, or whether they retreated across the sea to Sakhalin or beyond, is not known. Meanwhile, the Satsumon culture seems to have been influenced by yet another arriving people group. The Emishi, the native inhabitants of northern Honshu, whose origins are also shrouded in mystery, had long been in conflict with the northward advancing Yamato people. Through a series of wars and incursions, the Emishi had slowly seen themselves become surrounded by Yamato. Though some Emishi decided to join their power to the Yamato settlers, intermarrying, trading, and living side by side with them, others found themselves pushed farther and farther north, eventually fleeing across the Tsugaru Straits to Eizo. While the Emishi living in Honshu eventually faded into the overall Yamato population, their separate culture and identity extinguished from history, the Emishi in Eizo may have found themselves integrating or perhaps influencing the Satsumon culture that flourished there. Exactly what became of the Emishi, the Satsumon, and the Okhotsk is unknown, but in their place, perhaps as a continuation of all three peoples, emerged the indigenous people of Hokkaido who still live on today, the Ainu. Speakers of a distinctly non-Japonic language, one perhaps on a continuum with the Jomon or Emishi languages, the Ainu also appear vastly different from their southern neighbors. Indeed, early Western visitors to Eizo perceived them as a sort of lost Caucasian people. Americans tended to liken them in appearance and custom to Native Americans. Their men wore huge, burly beards, and their women tattooed the area around their mouths in a distinctive black ink. The Ainu of the time lived across Eizo, with separate communities in Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands northeast of the Eizo mainland, speaking different dialects. They hunted the interiors of their island homelands, fished the seas, and traded with people to the islands even farther north, and with others on the nearby Asian mainland. To the Ainu, Hokkaido was their ancestral homeland, the Ainu Moshir, as said in their tongue. To the slowly encroaching Yamato Japanese, it was Eizo, a foreign land of so-called hairy barbarians. What exactly Eizo was to the Yamato remained hazy, as the term referred to all the lands of these barbarians, including Sakhalin and the Kurils. It was not until hundreds of years later that accurate maps were made of the area that distinguished between these various landmasses. Legends remain of early Japanese Buddhist priests who had gone to Eizo to proselytize to the Ainu, but of what became of them, we know not. Needless to say, their religion did not take root, as the Ainu animist religion remained strong. Though some Yamato trading outposts were probably set up on the island as early as the 700s, the first real Yamato population to settle in Eizo only arrived in the 12th century, as some seeking refuge from wars and famine in northern Honshu crossed the Tsugaru Strait and set up small communities in the southern parts of Oshima Peninsula, where the rich fisheries off the coast supplied them with food and trade. Others came to pan Eizo rivers in search of elusive gold, while the newly established Kamakura shogunate, which ruled over Japan from 1185, began sending convicts into exile in this distant, foreign land. These small Yamato enclaves could perhaps be compared to the earliest English settlements in North America, like Roanoke and Jamestown, although the Yamato here had much easier access to their homeland, with Honshu just across the short Tsugaru Strait, rather than an entire ocean away. Like those colonies, these new Yamato transplants had to learn to subsist in a new land where their usual crops might not grow, and where the local climes were more extreme than they were used to. They found themselves both coming into conflict and simultaneously completely reliant on the local peoples they encountered there. People who vastly outnumbered them and whom they considered barbarians, but who knew the lay of the land and how to survive there much better than these initial interlopers could dream of. Trade with the Ainu was key to these settlers' lives in Ezo, but their relationship with them was tenuous enough to require the building of simple wooden forts and barricades to ward off Ainu attack, complete with surrounding Buddhist cemeteries. Ainu taboos regarding the dead were thought to prevent them from coming too close. For their part, the Ainu's interactions with these southern foreigners were just as complicated. While intrusions into their land and the disruption of important salmon spawning grounds by Yamato hunting for gold in local rivers was irksome, the Ainu also came to depend on goods they could receive via trade with the Yamato. Rice, sake, and advanced metalworks brought across the Tsugaru Strait. As trade with the Yamato became more important, Ainu lifestyles shifted, just one example being the abandoning of a tradition of Ainu metalworking in favor of superior wares from Honshu. Another item they came to treasure was Japanese lacquerware, which became a traditional item for the storage of family valuables. But desire for healthy trade was not enough to prevent real conflict from breaking out between the Ainu and the foreigners in their midst. While trade between the two peoples had started off more or less as that between equals, the Yamato began to see the Ainu more as a lesser people, bringing tribute to a more powerful neighbor. Abuses of power by the Yamato and unfair trading became more prevalent, and Ainu resentment grew in turn. As has happened throughout history, these unfair power dynamics between indigenous and foreign interloper made violence almost inevitable. The first major war between Ainu and Yamato on Ezo broke out in 1457, known as Koshaman's War, or Koshaman no tatakai. What started as a simple trade dispute regarding a sword was enough to fan the fires of resentment into a full-blown blaze of violence. A Yamato blacksmith, enraged by an Ainu customer's displeasure with the quality and price of the short sword he had ordered, plunged the bespoke dagger into his young customer's body. Seeking revenge, Koshaman, an Ainu leader, led groups of infuriated Ainu to attack the 12 fortified Yamato outposts on Oshima Peninsula. They managed to defeat the Yamato defenders at many of the forts, sacking them and razing the outposts to the ground. These Ainu victories were not enough to drive the Yamato off the island, however. While 10 of the 12 forts fell to their attacks, one fort withstood the Ainu barrage under the stout leadership of one Takeda Nobuhiro, a young samurai associated with the locally powerful Kakizaki family. Successfully defending the fort, he led a counterattack against Koshaman's forces. After various battles with many losses on both sides, Nobuhiro finally managed to ambush Koshaman, felling both the Ainu leader and his sons under a hail of arrows. The Ainu revolt had ended, and with it their greatest chance to beat back the advancing Yamato. Nobuhiro became one of the great Yamato heroes of the history of Hokkaido, and the Kakizaki officially invited him into their family. Eventually, he became the head of their clan, which itself came to supplant the local Abe clan as the leaders of the Yamato settlers on Ezo. In 1516, the Ashikaga shogun granted the Kakizaki the right to tax ships coming in and out of Ezo harbors. As the Kakizaki consolidated power in their area of Ezo, more skirmishes and battles with the Ainu came at intermittent periods. A peace was formed in 1551, and the Kakizaki at first worked to implement fairer rules regarding the Ainu to prevent further conflicts disrupting their trade. In 1560, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, fresh off his conquest of the Japanese mainland and the unification of the country, bestowed upon the Kakizaki the right to administer their part of Ezo as a fief. He admonished them to use their border holdings to protect Japan from the northern barbarians at their doorstep. The newly empowered Kakizaki changed their names to Matsumai, constructing a castle in their capital of the same name. Thus began what is now known as the Matsumai era, a period of over 200 years where the Matsumai clan held sole power over their part of Ezo. In many ways, the Matsumai holdings were a colony in the true sense of the word, an extension of foreign power on a distant land far from that power's capital, where a minority group administered land occupied by a majority indigenous group, taking advantage of the resources of the occupied territory to send it off to the mainland, all the while privileging themselves over the native inhabitants of the area. Despite all this, Ezo as a whole was not truly part of Japan, at least not yet. The Matsumai created an official delimiting line between the area where Yamato were allowed to settle, this area being called the Wajinshi, which occupied just part of the southern Oshima Peninsula, and between the vast majority of Ezo that was to be considered the frontier lands occupied by the Ainu, called the Ezochi. All trade with the Ainu and the Ezochi was to go through the Matsumai and be taxed by them, giving the clan a monopoly on wealth created via Ainu trade. Any fishing or trade outposts in the Ezochi were also to be made only with Matsumai permission, and no Yamato were allowed to winter in the Ezochi. Nonetheless, fishing outposts from this area eventually developed into many of the major coastal towns and cities of modern Hokkaido. Despite initial attempts to keep good relations with the Ainu, the Matsumai could be heavy-handed in their treatment of their indigenous neighbors. When they opened a fishing outpost in Kushiro in 1635, the Matsumai forcibly moved an inland group of Ainu to the site in order to use them as manpower for their fishing exploits. This sort of wanton use of the Ainu barbarians, almost perceived as non-humans by the Yamato, resulted in more outbreaks of war between the colonizers and the colonized. In 1668, a charismatic Ainu leader named Shakushain launched a war against the Yamato for their interference in an ongoing rivalry he had with another Ainu clan. He gathered other clans to his cause using anger at Yamato unfairness as a rallying cry. His army assaulted Yamato towns and took Yamato ships at sea, killing as many as 400 Yamato people. The war became serious enough that the Tokugawa shogun in distant Edo, modern Tokyo, commanded his northern lords to send troops across the sea to assist the Matsumai in their battles against the Ainu, something which shows the importance the central government put on the Matsumai domain as a frontier fief. Shakushain and his forces were eventually routed, and he surrendered. During a celebratory feast following the peace treaty he had signed, Shakushain was murdered in cold blood by the victorious Matsumai soldiers. Yamato domination was once again asserted. In 1716, the Matsumai lord was conferred the official title of daimyo, recognizing his suzerainty over the Wajinshi, and bringing the area even closer into the mainland Japanese system. The shogunate's interest in the Ainu continued. In 1717, saw the creation of an office for Ainu affairs located in Ezo, which was supported by taxes levied on local fisheries. The fisheries themselves were the lifeblood of the Wajinshi, with huge amounts of caught herring being sold farther south as a treasured source of quality fertilizer. Ezo herring may have fertilized up to 50% of Japanese rice fields by 1740. In order to increase profits, the Matsumai would subcontract their trading posts around the island to interested merchants, who would then use or even force nearby Ainu to work as seasonal laborers. This system, called basho ukeoi, became the standard feature of the unbalanced Yamato-Ainu relationship for well over 100 years. The 1700s saw the Yamato population in their section of Ezo grow, as did their abuses against the Ainu. Conversely to the Wajinshi population boom, the indigenous population continued to fall, their communities ravaged by new diseases and emaciated by the diminishing stock of deer and fish, as the Yamato population took more of the island's resources. In the year 1600, there had been approximately 50,000 Ainu on Hokkaido, as opposed to only 12,000 Yamato. A century later, in 1700, the Ainu were only barely holding on to their majority. Their population decreased to only 30,000 Ainu against 20,000 Yamato. Yet another 100 years onwards, in 1800, there were only 20,000 Ainu, while the Yamato population on the island had grown to 30,000, meaning that by the turn of the 19th century, the Yamato now outnumbered the Ainu in their own homeland, even if those Yamato still mostly lived in the geographically smaller area of the Wajinshi. The final major Ainu uprising occurred in 1789, spurred on by horrific mistreatment of Ainu in the east of Ezo under the basho ukeoi system. Bands of Ainu raided eastern trade posts and towns, killing up to 70 Yamato before the revolt was put down. 37 Ainu, captured and held as instigators of the revolt, were executed. This was the end of major armed Ainu resistance to the Yamato. It was around this time that the Ainu were replaced as the source of major Yamato concern in these northern borderlands. The frontiers of Japan and Russia came into closer and closer contact between the years 1770 to 1813, as Russian exploration of their newly acquired Far East melded into the Japanese northern frontiers of Ezo, including the poorly mapped and still mutually mysterious areas of the Kurils and the large island of Sakhalin. Russians and their ever-growing population centers in Siberia hoped that Japan would prove to be an apt source of trade, the products of which could more easily be brought to Siberia via northern Japan than from distant St. Petersburg or Moscow. Russian missions to Azo in 1778 and 1779 managed to meet with Matsumai officials, but this was during Japan's long period of official isolation, which is often called sakoku in modern literature. And the Matsumai, ultimately bound by the strict isolationist rules of the Tokugawa shogunate, simply directed the Russians to trade with the Ainu in specifically decided locales in the Kurils, or to make the long sea journey south to Nagasaki, where perhaps they could trade via Dejima, the only site of allowed, although limited, trade with Western powers. Following this suggestion, other Russian officers later went to Nagasaki in search of trade. However, they were kept waiting in the harbor for months on end, disallowed by Nagasaki officials to even set foot off their ships. After this long period of waiting, they were finally rebuffed, causing their leader, Rezanov, to send ships to attack Japanese outposts in the Kurils and Sakhalin. They burnt the outposts to the ground and also attacked 2 Japanese ships at sea. These attacks touched off a period of great paranoia regarding the Russians and incited panic in Azo. Troops were sent to outposts throughout the frontier to ward off attacks, and a system of bonfire beacons was installed from Cape Soya to Matsumai to warn the capital in case of Russian incursions, though none more came. The situation with this new neighbor to the north was of extreme concern to the shogunate on the mainland, leading them to take interest in the island of Azo. They sent expeditions to the island to see the state of Matsumai control there, and came away disappointed. Worried that Matsumai mismanagement of the Ainu would lead to the resentful among them to side with the Russians on the occasion they decided to make a move on Azo, the shogunate made a decisive move. By 1799, they took over direct control of eastern Hokkaido, installing troops in the trading posts there, effectively militarizing the border area. To the south, in the Wajinshi, they set up a magistrate in the town of Hakodate, minimizing Matsumai power in their own domain. Soon after, they forced the Matsumai to relinquish the domain entirely, moving the lordly family away from Azo, and placing all power in the Wajinshi in shogunate hands. 200 years of Matsumai rule seemed at an end. The shogunal magistrate in the new Azo capital of Hakodate tried various schemes to begin developing the island, hoping to populate it more thoroughly with Japanese, thus heading off any Russian ideas of conquest of the island under the guise of it being some sort of unclaimed land. Samurai farmers were brought in to settle some of the more northerly parts of the island, but the cold Azo winters defeated them. As the 19th century moved on, more and more foreigners found their way to Azo, whether on purpose or not. The age of whaling brought to the seas surrounding Hokkaido American and British ships in search of the numerous cetaceans for whom the waters were home. Whaling ships in search of provisions, as well as foreign castaways washing ashore, meant that the people of Azo, both Japanese and Ainu, kept on encountering foreigners despite the sanctions against such meetings imposed by the shogunate. Despite these worrying developments, the shogunate eventually withdrew from direct rule of the Wajinshi for lack of funds. The financial situation for the ruling Tokugawa family was becoming more dire with each decade of the 19th century. The shogunate returned the Matsumai to power as defenders of the Azo frontier. However, the Matsumai rule could not last long. Unbeknownst to either them or the shogunate, the age of the samurai and of Japanese isolation was coming to an end. American President Millard Fillmore had sent Admiral Matthew C. Perry to Japan under instructions of opening up the country to foreign trade. When Perry's so-called black ships, powerful steam-powered vessels of war brimming with cannon, the likes of which Japan had never seen, steamed into Uraga Harbor in 1853, the age of isolation came tumbling down. By the time Perry returned to Japan a year later as promised in his ultimatum to the shogun, the Tokugawa government had decided to capitulate to foreign demands. They opened up 2 ports for American trade, one in Shimoda, in modern Shizuoka, and the other was in Hakodate, in Azo, both locations perhaps having been chosen to keep the Americans as far away from central power as possible. In fact, Perry himself had requested access to Matsumai, which he believed to still be the capital of Azo. However, it was refused him. The shogunate claimed it was controlled by its own lord, and thus was beyond the powers of the central government. Perry sailed to Hakodate to ensure the port met his standards, which it did amply. He called it one of the best harbors in the world, likening it to Gibraltar. The townspeople fled as the ships approached, and Hakodate officials, claiming ignorance of the Tokugawa decree to open Hakodate to the Americans, resisted their landing in the harbor. Perry prepared a bombardment, but was spared the need to act when officials acquiesced. The townspeople remained hidden during his initial visit, and Perry's sailors saw not a single Japanese woman their entire time in Hakodate. They did, however, encounter Ainu, who Perry's men described as under the absolute will of their Japanese taskmasters. Thus began Hakodate's history as point of contact between Japan and the outside world, fitting as it was for a major port on land that was only just starting to be considered anything other than a frontier. Russia soon had its own treaty allowing trade there, and they began to make their mark on the city. Eizo officials began investing in farming to help cater to foreign seamen, especially with the raising of cattle for beef. In fact, Hokkaido remains a major domestic source of beef and milk for Japan to this very day. Meanwhile, foreign attention towards the Ainu worried Japanese officials, who were concerned about potential Ainu revolts. From 1855, Japanese settlers were officially allowed to move into the Eizochi lands previously reserved for the Ainu, and those specially designated military and business enterprises. The full colonization of the Ainu lands had begun, and the more Yamato who moved into the land, the less the Ainu could practice their traditional ways of life, and the less likely it became that they could ever overcome the Japanese in a revolt. Like so many other settlement enterprises throughout world history, the land of the Ainu was deemed empty by the Japanese government, ripe for full-on colonization. The Ainu, long dominated by the Yamato but still generally free to live in their own land, would soon be surrounded and pushed out of even that. To put it mildly, these were tumultuous times for Japan. Hardly a decade after Perry forced the Tokugawa shogunate to open up Japan to him and an ever-growing list of foreign countries, the samurai of Satsuma and Choshu domains, far in the south of Japan, rose up in revolt against the 250-year-old shogunate. Intending to return the emperor in Kyoto to real power and to restore Japanese honor vis-a-vis the foreign powers they perceived the shogun as practically kowtowing to, their revolution saw the weakened Tokugawa regime falling far faster and more easily than could ever have been anticipated. This brought major change in Eizo as well, as the fleeing shogunate loyalist forces led by Admiral Enomoto Takeaki sailed to the island, defeating the Matsumai in battle after battle. Matsumai itself and Hakodate fell to Enomoto's army, and for almost a year's time, Eizo became a separate breakaway state from the Japanese mainland, referred to by modern scholars as the Eizo Kyowakoku, the Eizo Republic. Enomoto's entreaties to be allowed to maintain the samurai way of life and to develop Eizo under the leadership of a Tokugawa heir were denied by the new Meiji government now ruling the Japanese mainland. His brief era as president of his so-called Samurai Republic saw new attempts at organizing the island and outreach to the foreigners and Ainu in his new domain. But whatever changes he hoped to carry out were cut short by the invading Meiji army. The major battles that occurred at sea and on land between the rebel samurai forces and the Meiji were deadly, leaving 2/3 of Hakodate in ruins by the time they had finished. Enomoto finally capitulated. The age of samurai on Eizo was over. After the rebels and their short-lived republic had been put down, the Meiji began the final and full incorporation of all the main island of Eizo into Japan. The residence inside the star-shaped fortress of Goryokaku that had housed the Republic of Eizo government was demolished, and the reconstruction of Hakodate was begun. To bring the land fully into modern Japan, the Meiji needed a new name for the island that would separate it from the connotations of Eizo, a land of barbarians, a frontier that was beyond the knowledge and scope of most Japanese. Matsuda Takeshiro, an explorer who had covered more ground on Hokkaido than perhaps any other Yamato Japanese, and who had befriended many Ainu and even learned their language, submitted 6 potential names, including Kai Hokudo, meaning Ocean Northern Route, and Hokkaido, Northern Kai Road. Matsuda, who had respect for the Ainu, had chosen the Kai in his Hokkaido to represent their people, as he somewhat erroneously believed this was the word that they used for the island in their own tongue. The government liked the sound of Hokkaido, but preferred the kanji meanings of Kaihokudo, and rearranged the former to be read like the latter. Thus, Hokkaido, Northern Sea Route, was born. Ezo, both as the homeland of the Ainu and as a breakaway samurai state, was no more. The Meiji began work on a newly planned capital for their new Hokkaido, to be named Sapporo. Unlike southern Hakodate, so close to Honshu and deeply entrenched in the lands that had been part of the Yamato Japanese settlement for centuries, Sapporo was deep in the former Ezochi, and thus traditionally Ainu, territory. An inland capital farther north and more central to the whole island indicated the permanent ownership of the entire land now claimed by Japan. Hakodate was consigned to the Ezo past. Sapporo was the future, one in which this newly named Hokkaido was simply another part of the homeland of the Japanese Empire. A postal service was established in Hakodate in 1872, and the telegraph service came in 1875. A ferry route soon plied the waters between Yokohama and Hakodate, and another ferry departed Aomori on the mainland every 4 days, crossing the Tsugaru Straits for Hokkaido. Only decades earlier, an explorer from Honshu hoping to see Ezo would have to wait for months simply to receive approval to venture into this borderland. As perhaps the final signal of just how much Hokkaido was now being considered fully Japan, the Meiji Emperor himself visited the island in 1876. He met not only with his Yamato citizenry on the island, but even a group of Ainu, and attended an Ainu dance. He returned again to the island in 1881. Both times, the people greeted him with great fanfare. The story of Hokkaido continues with the tale of its development by the Meiji state. But this is a story worthy of its own detailed examination. By this point, the island once known as Ezo had been completely colonized and annexed. So much so, in fact, that it is now simply taken for granted as part of the Japanese mainland. The development saw a huge wave of immigration to the island as Meiji officials and hired foreign experts figured out how best to endure the frigid winters and make use of the vast lands of Hokkaido. Thousands of former samurai, including a group who had been part of the Republic of Ezo, destitute and without purpose now that their way of life was outlawed, moved to Hokkaido. The so-called tondenhei, former warriors turned farmers, founded many modern Hokkaido towns that exist in one form or another until this day. Mining, agriculture, and fishing industries flourished. Such agricultural developments nearly drove the Hokkaido deer to extinction. The Ezo wolf, one of only 2 species native to the Japanese archipelago, was not so lucky. The Ainu were subsumed by their colonizers. Their identity as a separate ethnicity and culture actively repressed by the increasingly imperious Meiji state as it began to stress a uniquely homogeneous Japan into which the Ainu could not fit. Yet today, they live on in Hokkaido, perhaps 30,000 among a population of almost 5.5 million. The Ainu language, like the Ezo wolf, is now thought extinct, having recently lost many of its last native speakers. Serious efforts to revitalize their culture are underway, however. In 1947, after World War II but still during the American occupation period, Hokkaido was made into a full and equal prefecture, on the same level as the other 46 prefectures of Japan. Ironically, towards the very tail end of the war, the island had barely avoided invasion and potential annexation from Russia, a fear strikingly similar to the one that had spurred the central shogunate government to incorporate Ezo more firmly into Japanese suzerainty over 150 years earlier. The aims of the Tokugawa shoguns of the time have now been carried out. Hokkaido has become irrevocably Japanese. Alright everyone, hope you enjoyed learning about how Hokkaido became the integral part of Japan it now is. It really is a beautiful and unique place with a separate history that deserves its own attention. Like I said earlier, northern Japan has been a major topic of study and authorship for me in the past year, so if you'd like to read about the Republic of Ezo, encounters with Russia, or Japan's one-time settlement of even more indigenous lands farther north in Sakhalin, feel free to check out the links below. And if you'd like me to make any of these articles into similar videos, leave me a comment or a like. I'd really like to thank both Ito Hiroki and Nishimura Keita for being so incredibly gracious and letting us use their beautiful footage of that unique northern island. Check out their content in the links below. For more on the Ainu language and current cultural revitalization efforts, I can also recommend Native Lang's recent video on Ainu linguistics and the Ainu My Voice short documentary. In English, Anne B. Irish's Hokkaido, A History of Ethnic Transition and Development on Japan's Northern Island is the current gold standard for the in-depth story of the island itself. I've been Noah Oskow, and if you like what you heard, hit subscribe, check out our channel and website, and if what we're doing here really strikes a chord with you, we'd be honored to have you as a patron. So, until next time, Genki den.